Hi and welcome to Spooky Isles. My name's David Saunderson, and today we're continuing our conversation about Dracula and its character with Dr. Kaja Franck. How are you, Kaja?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Good, thank you. Now, we're filming this just after the 1st of May or the 30th of April, which is Walpurgisnacht, which is the scene just after Dracula starts, or before Dracula starts, and it was the setting for Dracula's Guest, which was a short story by Bram Stoker, which was published in 1913. Now, Kaja, some people think this is a prequel. Some people think it's just just the first draft of the first chapter. What do you think Dracula's Guest is?
I kind of think it's a little bit of both. So when it's published by Stoker's widow, you can see that it's a standalone story in many ways. And really, the riddle of Dracula's Guest at least partially gets solved when we find Stoker's working notes. A lot of people had assumed that, again, really interesting. Up until the 1950s and the 1960s, if you said that you were working on Dracula as a literature student, you were essentially being told, well, this is just a ridiculous bit of pop culture. It's lightweight, it's frothy. Why would you study? So really, studying the Gothic and studying Dracula is quite a recent phenomenon. And so these people, when they first started sort of studying and looking at Dracula's work, and I'm thinking in particular Sir Christopher Frayling here, they didn't have a huge amount of information to go on. They're very much the pioneers. And then it's discovered all these working notes come out, and people realize that Stoker had been planning and planning and planning. And in particular, he had been planning in terms of dates. And Walpurgisnacht had been a really important date. Now, when we look at his early plans, we see him editing it. So I would certainly say that at one point, he did want to have more detail about Harker's journeys through Munich and then into Transylvania. But it seems that he probably drafted that and then went, no, that's not working, and then returned to it. But there are these wonderful, wonderful little hints in there. So one in particular is in Dracula's Guest, Jonathan is attacked or sees a beautiful blonde woman, the Countess.
I'll stop you there. You referred to him as Jonathan.
Yes! Oh!
Hey!
No, you got me! You got me!
Yes, I do. So explain why that is wrong.
Oh, because his name is never, ever, ever mentioned in it. And you assume it's John. Well, if you read it because it's Dracula's Guest, then the assumption is Jonathan. But as other critics have said, who are clearly far better with it, let me blame my baby brain, who are far better with this, they've said his behavior in the character within Dracula's Guest, the protagonist, although can be read as Jonathan Harker, actually is a lot braver than Jonathan Harker, goes off on all these adventures and ignores all the advice. But one of the reasons why my brain caught on that is that the protagonist sees this blonde Countess of Dollingen, who appears to be a vampire. And then within Dracula itself, the novel, when Jonathan comes across the Brides of Dracula, one of them is blonde, and he mentions, I feel like I knew her from somewhere, or I had met her before. And some people have connected the two of them together. Now, one of the other reasons that people have suggested that perhaps Bram Stoker edited out that earlier section was because of its similarities to Carmilla by Stoker's friend. So he knows Sheridan of Fanu, and he reads Carmilla, and it has an impact on the way that he's writing. So some people have suggested, because it's set in Germany, that essentially Stoker goes, let's get rid of this earlier part. For me, though, I think the biggest issue with Dracula's Guest is it's called Dracula's Guest. So the short story almost doesn't work unless you know about the novel. Because until you've read the novel, who's Dracula and what does it matter?
I suppose that's right. Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, it was clearly called Dracula's Guest because that's the way they were going to sell it and make lots of money, wasn't it? So uh, I think it's probably just he obviously took a long time and rewrote the book a lot of times, and this was one way. It's not historic fact, so you can't say, "Oh, haha, there's a mistake there," and that's not. It's conflicting. It's just he changed his mind, and it's also written in a very different way, isn't it? It's not in the similar way of Dracula, which was more like diaries and invoices and all bits and pieces. Could it be that he just decided that wasn't working that way, and he just tried to do something different?
Absolutely. I mean, the process of writing a novel is long and arduous, as anyone who has ever attempted to write, and I've never even given it a go because it just looks too scary. And the notes that he made really show us, and I would say, if there's anyone watching this, you can get copies of his notes. They're so interesting. They include lists of his sources, books that he was reading. You can see the moment where it stops just being Count Vampire or Wampir and becomes Count Dracula because of the books that he's found in the library in Whitby that talk about Vlad the Impaler. So if you really want to sort of get a little bit of sense of the method behind the novel, I highly recommend getting a copy of his notes and his working notes. I think it is just highly likely that he was testing things out and he was seeing how things worked. One of the things that people have also argued is that perhaps his wife had a little bit more to do with editing it, and that, I think more cynical people have said that essentially his wife released them because she was like, the estate isn't doing that well. I need to make some money off the back of some of his other writing. And again, you can't, it's really hard to guess at the intention of people who are now long past. But I find it particularly interesting because for me, one of the things it does is it really cements the relationship between Dracula and wolves. So in the short story, the protagonist runs when he sees this blonde, and we're to assume vampire, being hit by lightning, and runs, swoons, and wakes up with what looks to be a wolf on his chest, licking at his neck. And when he's rescued, the soldiers who rescue him say, well, they shot at the wolf ran off. They shot at it. And one of them says, oh, well, it wasn't silver bullet, so it wouldn't have worked anyway, would it? Suggesting there's a werewolf quality to this particular wolf. But at the same time, soldiers also say, if that wolf hadn't been lying on you, you'd have frozen to death. So that it both saves you, but there's something very scary about it as well.
That's why I really like Dracula's Guest. There's a lot of cool stuff in it. It's easy to read, whereas some of the reading of Dracula, it's a long book, but it does change the different voices in it. This is just a straight narrative of this is what happened on my trip, or not my trip, but the person writing that thing. And you've got all this quite cool stuff like that. I forget the types of lights. Are they St. George's or something like that? Because it's around St. George's Day, or there's something going on. There's lots of good stuff in it. I really enjoyed Dracula's Guest. What do you think about it?
I personally, yeah. I mean, I just think it's a nice, tight little narrative, and it is fun to read alongside the novel in particular, because it makes you feel a bit like a literary detective. So when you cross compare, say, the notes with the novel, with Dracula's Guest, the timelines and when things were meant to be, you just get sort of like, there's just a nice little sense of, oh, I guess that would have been here, or that would have been there. And I do think it's quite interesting reading it, as you said, switching from the first person of the opening of Dracula with Jonathan Harker dutifully filling in his diary, to then going into Dracula's Guest, which is significantly sort of tighter in some ways. So when you read the opening of Jonathan Harker's diary, there is a lot of sort of noting of what people are wearing and folklore and things like that. Whereas Dracula's Guest, it's a short, tight little narrative, and it's it's almost more uncanny in some ways because not everything is solved. You see the woman, the blonde woman, you don't know who she is, she's scary, she seems to be hit by lightning, then there's this wolf episode, and so the narrative is tighter, but what happens in it remains more open and more open to interpretation. And in some ways that makes it a slightly spookier and more gothic text because there's no resolution.
Yeah.
All we know is the protagonist doesn't die, but we don't really know what they saw and what the meaning of it is.
And it gives I mean, we think of it as a backstory to Dracula, to the novel. It could be another fellow. We probably think it might be another fellow. We just assume because it's what it is. I'm going to go read it. I think I have to go read it. It's not very long, so I think I have to go read it, and I haven't read it in a few years, so it just whet my appetite now. Have we actually ever seen a film of it? I can't think there's ever been film, really.
Not that I can think of.
No, if anyone knows if it's been filmed, write it down in the comments so we can go watch it. So because I can't think of it. I mean, no, not at all. But anyway, that's all good. Anyway, thank you, Kaja. I think what we're going to do, we need to explore the werewolf what you just said there about that, because I think that's the interesting part, because we know in other adaptations Dracula does turn into some kind of beast looking, Francis Ford Coppola turns into a big bat in the most recent one. He's got a wolf on his body that comes off. So we have to find out, is Dracula really a werewolf as well? So we'll talk about that in the next one.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll talk to you later. See you. Bye.